Hello. Recently I've had to help out a customer who had managed to get himself very confused between NTSC and PAL recordings on 8mm tapes. So of course NTSC is the TV system that was used in USA and Japan and other countries, and PAL is used in most of Europe. And in this particular case, the customer had tapes which he believed were NTSC. He had bought an NTSC player to play them on and then discovered it didn't work and came to me for help. So let's explain a little bit about what you can and can't do, and I've got a heap of equipment here and we can demonstrate some of the things, and even just playing with these just now I've learned a few things, so let's get stuck in. The first thing to mention is that 8mm recordings can be three different types of format. There can be the earliest Video 8, which is an analog recording and modest quality, sort of Betamax quality. And then there was High 8, which is somewhat better, it's sort of Super VHS quality. And then there's the final version, which is Digital 8, which is basically recording a mini DV type recording onto an 8mm tape. And that was made, in this case, this is a Hitachi camcorder, so that's something unusual. Most of them were made by Sony, and that gives really excellent results. So let's mix and match a few of these things and let's see what happens. We'll start by trying to play an analog Video 8 recording on a machine which is Video 8 and High 8 capable, but is only intended for PAL. Let's see what happens. So that's just a scrambled mess, and that's typical of what happens if you try to play an NTSC recording on a PAL machine. If we try to play it on something like a Sony EVS 9000, it won't work. You'd need the NTSC equivalent, which is an EVS 7000. Alright, what about if you tried to play that tape in a camcorder? Well, the answer is maybe. It depends a little bit on the camcorder you select. And here I have a particular Sony High 8 one. It's model CCD TR920E. So it's one of the relatively later High 8 camcorders. Let's try to play a NTSC tape on it. And quite surprisingly perhaps, it actually plays it just fine. So this, being one of the later High 8 decks, does support both NTSC and PAL playback. But be aware, there's still a gotcha here, in that I'm now playing a different part of this recording I've made on NTSC equipment, and all we're getting is a horrible noise and occasionally white flashes of light. And what's going on there is that that particular recording was made on a Digital 8 camcorder, and analog players won't support it. But with our analog recording, that's playing fine in good colour. It took a few seconds to latch onto it when we started the tape, but is otherwise fine. So you might say, okay, that's good. I can now capture both PAL and NTSC analog recordings with this camcorder. How could I digitize it? And you would typically want to feed this to some sort of digital capture device. I use Canopus ADVC55. For example, you could go for S-Video and left and right audio here and capture it. Except that won't work. The problem is that this is outputting a mixed up version of NTSC and PAL called NTSC 4.43, and it has the line and frame rates of NTSC but the colour system of PAL, and many capture devices will not understand that and will give you a black and white picture. What you'd need is something like this. It's a digital time-based corrector, and this one can convert from that NTSC 4.43 mixed up format into pure NTSC. What we do is set these controls to the pure NTSC mode, and it would take in NTSC 4.43, output pure NTSC, which you can then capture on your ADVC55 or similar capture device. So that's all well and good, but most people don't have access to these, so this is not a great solution these days for playing back NTSC tapes for video capture. I think at this point it's worth mentioning what my normal capture route is for 8mm. And it may not suit everybody, but this is the way I recommend capturing 8mm analog or digital tapes. So this is a Sony Digital 8 camcorder. This is a Sony TRV 120E, and it's a very capable device. It may be small, but it's capable of doing a lot. So let me tell you a few things about it. It will play back analog video 8 and high 8 tapes, as well as digital 8 recordings. Now, that's a very key feature, and it's one of the reasons these are still rather quite valuable, and you'll see them on eBay selling for hundreds of pounds sometimes, because that analog playback is a great route for capturing. Be careful if you're thinking of buying a digital 8 camcorder for playing back your analog tapes. Most camcorders do so, and I'll provide a link down below for my webpage where I show which models of camcorders do and don't play digital analog tapes. Here's one which doesn't. Model TRV 140E, so that's the 120, this is the 140, and you think, oh, it's a later model, bound to do it. No. If you put an analog tape in there, it just won't play anything. So don't get caught out with them. They're not worth anything. So back to our TRV 120E. As well as analog outputs, it's also got a firewire output, which is used, of course, for when you're playing back digital 8 tapes. It can give you a pure lossless playback from the tape, which even includes the original time date information, which some software can access. And my favourite video capture software actually for taking the DV stream from these is called Pinnacle Studio. It's an old version, Pinnacle Studio 12. I find that's a little bit easier to use than the later versions, and you can even do things like split recordings up by the original time and date, which is really helpful. Another handy free utility, which is not supported anymore but still works, is WinDV, and you can do things like split that up as well. You can make individual recordings based on original time and date information, provided the clock was set properly on the camcorder at the beginning. This has nothing to do with having the time and date burnt onto the display, as you will have seen probably on some analog recordings. This is embedded in the data stream, and the same is true of mini DV tapes. So that's a great analog and digital player. And a great thing about it also in terms of playing analog tapes is that it has a built-in digital time-based corrector. And I've seen this work. You can have recordings which have a vertical wobble, sort of wobble in the image because it's been recorded on a faulty machine, or the camcorder was jostled during recording, or it's a copy from another tape. And this can completely eliminate that, take out all of that wobble with the digital time-based corrector. So the only thing it can't do, well, there's two limitations of this. Firstly, if you have recordings which have PCM digital audio soundtracks, as were recorded on a few high-end camcorders and other certain mains machines like the EVS 9000E I was talking about earlier, this can't play the PCM digital audio track. It can only play the AFM analog audio tracks. The other slight issue with capturing video with these is they had a small design compromise in that part of the image, which is normally in what they call the overscan area, off the edge of the image, beyond the bit you can normally view, they decided, well, that didn't really matter terribly much, and it doesn't matter terribly much. For example, there's head switching noise at the bottom. That's normal for all analog formats. But on the far right of the image, in the overscan area, the colours get inverted, so reds become greens and things for the last like 1% or so of the image. Now that never mattered if you're playing back on a TV, because it's in overscan, it doesn't display it, and that's true even of flat panel TVs. But if you're playing back in a computer and you get to see the entire image, you could get to see the head switching noise at the bottom, the inverted colour on the right hand edge, gaps at the left hand side, and maybe the top or junk at the top. So what I'll typically do is I'll expand the image by about 3% just to take off all that junk, and then people get a nice clean image they can display on any computer video player such as VLC player. I always recommend VLC player, it's really good. So those weaknesses aside, this is the ideal player for analog and digital tapes. And guess what? It plays back NTSC and PAL seamlessly. Let's demonstrate that. So let's try that same analog Video 8 NTSC recording on this TRV120E PAL Digital 8 player. It's detected that it's analog, gets a little confused for a second, and then it switches over to NTSC and plays the tape properly. And it's not just playing on the screen and on its own screen, but the firewire output will also output a good NTSC valid DV stream that we can capture on the computer. Everything looks fine there, except I've deliberately recorded a bit of rubbish recording here, which is typical of what you get on people's tapes. They'll have a good recording and then have a blank bit, and then in a moment they'll start having another recording again, because they just took the tape out at the end of one session and put it back in again, and you finish up with that glitch. And it doesn't matter for playback here, but it matters a lot, the playback for the DV output port, because you'll get corrupted data and it will abort the capture process. Whatever software you're using, say Pinnacle Studio as I tend to, that will stop. So every time your original tape had a junky bit of recording on it, your capture will stop. And if they're the sort of sloppy person who made lots of very scrappy recordings which they didn't edit together nicely, didn't come to the end of one and start the next, then you could end up stopping and starting dozens of times in order to capture all the recording off the tape. That's deeply frustrating. So this is okay for the odd tape, but for lots of, if you're doing it professionally as I am, you're running a transfer business, using a PAL player to play back NTSC analog tapes is frustrating. What I will show you though, also here, I've done another recording on this tape, as well as the analog NTSC recording. I have a small segment of Digital 8, and if we just go to that, it switches over to Digital 8 mode. You can see the logo on the screen there, and sure, yep, it'll play Digital 8 recordings as well. So it's a fairly good solution, but not without its flaws. A few analog camcorders, such as a TRV110, won't play back long play recordings, so just be aware of that. So what other options do we have if we want to play back analog NTSC tapes in the UK? Well, you could of course try to get hold of an NTSC machine. So I have a few here. Let's demonstrate. So the first camcorder I'm using here is an NTSC Hitachi Digital 8 camcorder. It's model VMD865LA. The power supply will work on 240 as well as 110 volts. And we're playing back that tape. It says auto sensing. It's switching over to analog. It's not the fastest machine. But there it is, playing back, giving out a pure NTSC playback for the analog recording, and there's no complaints with that. It's got stereo sound, it's got S-video out, and it's got a DV output port. There's the DV output port. So gaps in the recording may or may not abort the capture software on this pure Digital 8 player. I've found it to be much more likely that the capture software will continue to run if you do have a nasty crash edit on the tape. So it can be quite useful to have a pure NTSC player such as this. And so these are quite rare, these Hitachi models. And we'll let it do the auto sensing, and it will go into the digital 8 recording as well and play that fine. Well, I'm actually seeing a few errors. I don't know if you saw a few little squares and blocks sticking on the left hand side there. So it's not playing back this tape particularly well. It's fundamentally working, but the results are less than perfect. And you may say, well, why is that? Well, it's because I did something wrong, and let me show you what I did wrong. This is a video 8 tape, and digital 8 should be recorded on high 8 tapes. And though it will tend to work on video 8, it can be that the tapes would only play back in the same recorder as made, same machine as made the recording. So getting sort of blocks and squares like that using the wrong tape on the wrong player is not unusual, but that's obviously something of a nuisance. So that's not really a failing of this particular model of camcorder. But in general, I was never that keen on this Hitachi model. It worked, but I think maybe didn't give the very best results. Let's see if we can do better. How about a nice Sony NTSC digital machine? This is a TRV 110 in NTSC. So let's pop a tape in that. Okay, so of course it plays back the analog tape just fine, and it will play back the digital 8 tape later just fine. So that's a very good solution if you can get hold of one. And of course this has a DV port as well, so we can capture from there. And this is actually the least likely, I find, to abort capture due to gaps in the recording. It can still do it, but it's more likely to work. So you'd say, right, we've got the perfect solution here, and it very nearly is. Not sure if this will play back long play recordings. I don't have any analog NTSC long play recordings to try. But this particular machine has another slight drawback. It is possible to record in 4:3 or widescreen in the digital 8 format. And for some weird reason, this particular player, when it's faced with recordings it doesn't understand, will, or glitches in the tape, will sometimes send out the signal that it's switched from 4:3 to widescreen, and in doing so that aborts the capture process. So the capture process says, oh, I can't carry on recording because you've changed aspect ratio. Right, that's now playing the digital 8 recording. So we have this difficulty on this particular one, and it may be a weakness or fault in this one, that it is sometimes sending out 4:3 and 16:9 data through the firewire port saying that I'm switching between these different aspect ratios, when in actual fact all that's happened is the image has changed that's on the picture. So that was also quite annoying with this particular player and caused me to have to restart recording sometimes. Alright, can we do better again? Imagine if we didn't use a camcorder at all. Imagine if we actually used a dedicated NTSC player video recorder. Have a look at this. This is a weird thing. This is a camcorder without the camera. So it's a recorder and player. It takes the same batteries as a camcorder. It has many of the same sort of features and connectors. Nicely, this one's got S-Video in as well. It's got firewire, of course, there. And yet it is a video recorder, not a camcorder. A portable video recorder. I think this is extremely sweet, and I really like this machine. Let's connect this one up. The mechanism inside clearly has been lifted from a camcorder. Kind of got two eject components to it. So here we have it now playing that NTSC tape. This will, I believe, support long play recordings as well. It doesn't abort and do weird things and start telling me there's 4:3 and 16:9 image changes. So this is my go-to machine. And remember I mentioned earlier that slight problem with the colour on the far right beyond the image that you'd see on a TV, that you get a band of inverted colours. Well, it doesn't apply to NTSC. That's a PAL issue. So these really are excellent players for analog or digital NTSC tapes. I'm switching over to the digital recording, and as you can expect, that is absolutely excellent. Right, what about if you have the opposite problem and you want to play PAL tapes on a NTSC machine? We've already demonstrated that we can play NTSC tapes, at least within certain constraints, on PAL machines. Well, let's start by playing PAL recording. Will it work? And the answer is yes. It will play digital 8 recordings just perfectly. So that all looks very encouraging, doesn't it? Let's try a PAL analog recording. It's detected that it's an analog recording, but playback is non-existent. And if we maybe put it into freeze frame or picture search, we might see a little bit of what's going on. Let's try that. You can see the line and frame rates are wrong, the colour's a mess. You can kind of see fragments of image in there, but no, it's not going to play an analog PAL recording on this machine. Not built for it. So what can I say to viewers in, say, the States who want to be able to play analog tapes? Well, buy a Sony TRV-120E or similar digital 8 deck camcorder from the UK and get it sent to you. It's fairly lightweight, so it shouldn't cost too much to post. It'll run on the same mains adapters as you use in the USA, so you don't have to worry about that. They will play long play and standard play recordings. It'll play analog and digital ones. So we've got everything covered. So and it'll also, if you accidentally put an NTSC tape in there, it'll display something. So it kind of covers everything off. The only trouble is they are fetching stubbornly high prices in the UK. So why was my customer confused? Well, I'll tell you. He'd got some tapes that were marked up for the NTSC system. The running times were marked up for NTSC. The tapes are marked P6-running time. 6 as in 60 Hertz, think of your mains frequency. So that would be correct for USA, those regions, and parts of Japan, whereas tapes sold in Europe were marked P5 for 50 Hertz frequency, and then the running times. So he got confused, thought he had an NTSC recording even though it was only an NTSC sold tape, had recorded on it in PAL using his own camcorder, and believed he needed an NTSC player, which he didn't, and he'd bought this Sony NTSC High 8 camcorder, which works fine, but wasn't going to play his PAL tapes. And what doesn't happen sometimes is Sony just make things worse. Look at this. Is this the most confusing statement ever? So, this video Walkman cannot be used with the single system TV of PAL C-Cam, PAL M, nor PAL N. If it is the multi-system including NTSC, it can be played back. What? And then it says for NTSC. That's desperately confusing. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this and learned a little bit about NTSC and PAL interoperability on 8mm. And also we got to play with this absolutely gorgeous 8mm deck. I'll do plenty more content on audio and video technology in the near future. Bye for now.